Okay, so remember I said that, the US had a trade imbalance, right? And so what ended up happening was that the flexible exchange rate regime came into play, all right? Where your value of your currency depending on demand and supply. However, it's not all, it's demand and supply, yes, but countries using their central banks would affect or effect the change in demand, the change in supply, artificially. All right, but we'll come to that. So the US dollar was considered to be overvalued because it had this huge trade deficit, all right, but it was still being used as the peg, if you want to, for lack of a better word. And so the US dollar did not really have the value that it was thought to have with that peg, because what was happening here is that you had other countries who had positive balance of payments, so their currencies were actually stronger, but because of this false value of the US dollar, it didn't appear that way. And of course, it had to change, right? And so the gold standard, remember gold was back in the US dollar?
Yes.
The US dollar had this demand because everybody was using it as the main exchange currency. And so you had more US in circulation than you had gold. All right? So the gold standard, that became problematic. Because the US is overvalued, you have more US dollars circulating in the economy, in the world, than they had in gold. All right? So in 1971, there was an agreement called the Smithsonian Agreement, which increased the price of gold, and they revalued the other currencies against the US. All right? The way they did that is to widen the band in which currencies were allowed to move. All right? So there was flexibility there. So the currency no longer had to stay within 1 plus or minus 1%, but that band was widened. It didn't last very long because, again, the US had a crisis. All right? US really had a currency crisis, but because it was always in modern times used as the international currency, it was seen as very valuable. If you do a little research, you will find out that the value of the US is not the highest valued currency now. Anybody knows what's the highest valued currency?
Is it still euro or Swiss?
The Swiss franc. The Swiss franc is the highest valued currency now, followed closely by the pound, and then the euro is a little below that. All right, and then the US. The Canadian right now, the Canadian isn't doing so well. It's quite low, which is good for some people. Yeah, so those are the currencies with the higher value right now. The Swiss franc is the highest. 1976, an agreement was signed in Jamaica, all right, where IMF members accepted flexible exchange rates. With that, the central banks were allowed to intervene in the currency markets. Now, if you haven't done elements of banking and finance and risk management, you may not have all the details on central banks. Hopefully you did it in regulatory, if you did regulatory. Most people in here should have had to do regulatory, except you're taking this as an elective. You should have had to do FINA 2001. It speaks to central banks, but the central bank conversation happens in elements of banking and finance. What's the purpose of the central banks? How the central banks keep the currency. They're the ones that issue currency, all right? And so central banks are the ones that are allowed to intervene in the currency markets to effect changes in currency. So if the value of the US dollar is depreciating rapidly, all right? The Federal Reserve will intervene, and what would they do what do you think they would do to increase the value of the US currency?
They would increase the amount of reserves that needs to be kept, therefore the value of the currency will go up.
How would they do that? Remember?
With legislation.
No, they go into the market.
Mm-hmm.
They go into the market and they buy or sell. What do they buy or sell?
Oh, securities. Yes.
Right? So they would go into the market to sell US securities. They could also create an artificial demand by purchasing back US securities. All right? So the central banks for the different countries are allowed to intervene in the market if their currencies are devaluing, all right? To push back up the demand. Under the Jamaica Agreement, the gold standard was completely abandoned, all right? Because now you have flexible exchange rates. They're allowing the currencies to quote unquote float, all right? Along with that, non-oil exporting countries, rich countries, those that are not so rich, sorry, and less developed countries were allowed more access to the IMF funds, because obviously now your exchange rate is flexible, it's floating, and if it's not being demanded out there in the market, the value is going to go down, and so it's going to affect your economy, right? And so under the Jamaica Agreement, a couple of things happened. Flexible exchange rates were established. Central banks were allowed to intervene in the currency market. Gold standard was abandoned, and less developed countries and countries that didn't have oil were allowed more access to IMF funds. If, depending on how much economics you would have done, you may know that Jamaica would have gone to IMF in the 1970s and to get funds via their standby arrangements, and that Jamaica was in a bit of a crisis at that time, and so they had some issues. Okay, so how does the demand and supply and the value of currencies, how does that really work? We're not going to go into the demand and supply curves and so on in here, but there are a couple of people in here who are going to have to do that. The gentlemen, those of you here for the first time, we have two groups in the class. We have international finance and we have international financial management. So the international finance people will do more of the econ type work. Okay, so let's talk about how a currency supply or demand changes. We spoke a little bit about it. So how would the demand for euros, for example, increase? How does the demand for a currency change? Go ahead, Karian. This line is you wanted to answer.
I guess some people, well, sorry, some countries, like when their own currency is weak, they prefer to have another currency that is stronger. So that would demand.
Demanded.
Yeah.
Why do you need money? I need currency.
To trade. So
Trade, yes.
when you're trading, let's say,
That's what that's.
5 countries right now are going to be trading in the US, then the demand for US currency will go up because more countries are seeking it to pay out.
Right, yes, so more countries that they're trading, they're purchasing from the US, and so the demand for US dollar will go up. But what do you know, what are some of the things that affect that, like the financial markets have a very significant role in the value of the US dollar, all right? So if the US financial markets decline, what tends to happen, the US dollar is going to depreciate as well. Or if depending on how the US economy is performing, people will demand more, all right? Another thing that affects the demand and supply is interest rates, all right? So if interest rates in the US are high, what do you think would happen to the demand for US dollar? Huh? It would actually increase. I'll tell you why. It would increase because persons making US dollar investments will get more funds. The demand increases in that way. However, when interest rates go up in the US, what happens to things like loans? The demand for loans is going to come down, right? And so the supply, so there's a balance. So it all depends on what happens between interest rates and financial markets and trade. All right? We'll get a little bit more into that when we discuss the balance of payments. Now, in terms of currencies, so Rashidi would have said earlier on that our currency is pegged to the US dollar, all right? It was an incorrect answer to that particular question. But our currency is pegged to the US dollar. So what you have is there are countries in the world like ours whose currency is pegged to the US dollar. So the central banks work to maintain that peg, all right? When our economies decline, when there are declines in our economies, all right, what tends to happen is our reserves, our backing ratio goes down, and so the central bank has to work very hard to ensure that it maintains it, all right? And so what will end up happening is, if economies are not doing well, the central bank may lend to the government, all right, in order to help the economy. The central bank may reduce interest rates in order to stimulate spending, all right? Because our currency is pegged though, we don't necessarily feel the effects that other countries feel when their economies decline. Because of the peg. But the central bank has to work really hard in terms of investing the funds to keep our currency strong. they have been able to maintain that peg, didn't have to change it, and maintain the value of the reserves such that the reserves, I don't think they have gone below 94% over all of the time that the currency was pegged. So just like the EC dollar, other currencies peg, some peg to the US, some peg to the sterling, it all depends, but many currencies peg to the US. Now there are different types of pegs, all right? So there are pegs and there's floating. So you have what you refer to as floating rates, which are completely determined by the market, okay? But bear in mind, I said the central bank can actually try to push up demand and supply, but it's still demand and supply that's working together. Then you have the managed floats, in which the country or the country's central bank will intervene. So there are some that will just allow it to float, all right? There are some that will intervene in the market. That is called a managed float. So they will actually go in the market and buy or sell. Then of course we talk about the peg. And the peg, there are different types of peg, okay? You have something called a crawling peg. You have the conventional peg, you have the crawling peg. There are different types of pegs. So exchange rate regimes. This is the policy of the country in relation to its currency, right? So you have no separate legal tender, meaning this country does not have its own money, its own currency, all right? And so with no separate legal tender, that country would use another currency. So for example, you have Ecuador, El Salvador, Panama, they use the US dollar, all right? They use the US dollar, and they would have an arrangement where their central bank now monitors their economy to ensure that they still have access to the US dollar. Then you have what we call a currency board. Prior to 1981, we had our islands were in a currency board arrangement, all right, where it was called the Eastern Caribbean Currency Authority. Okay, the currency board monetary policy is based on a legal commitment to exchange a home currency for a specified foreign currency at a fixed exchange rate with certain restrictions. We don't have restrictions on our exchange rate anymore, all right? In terms of, so take Barbados. In Barbados, you can't just go in the bank and buy US dollars like that. You have to get permission from the central bank, all right? In the currency board arrangement, the home currency is fully backed by foreign assets, like in our case, but we don't have exchange controls. Usually, in a currency board arrangement, there are exchange rate controls, all right? But there's no central bank. So Hong Kong, Bulgaria, Brunei, they don't have a central bank per se, all right? They have what you call a currency board. We got a central bank, I believe it was 1981. That won't be here now. Then you have the conventional peg. So the conventional peg is a fixed peg to another currency, or it could be a basket of currencies, right? So Saudi Arabia and Morocco are the examples there, and of course, the Eastern Caribbean and also Barbados.
It's pegged to US?
Huh?
Pegged to the US as well?
Pegged to the US, yeah. Okay? Then you have what you call stabilized arrangement. So you keep the spot rate within a specific range for a specified period of time. What does all of that mean? What is the spot rate? The spot rate means the rate today. the rate that you can exchange your currency for today. All right? Your spot rate could be up to 1 day. Okay? 2 days in some cases. Now, so they will keep that rate, the rate at which you buy and sell, all right, within a specified range for a period of time. So you could say, my currency is pegged to the US dollar at $2, at $1 US to $2 of my currency for the next 6 months. All right? But then there are triggers that would cause them to change that. And those are rules, they will have specific rules in place for that. Then you have what you call a crawling peg, okay? What this is, the currency is adjusted in small increments, but it's done in a at fixed rates for a period of time, okay? And that fixed rate that it's changed by is determined by identified indicators. So you know what the indicator is. In many places, it's inflation. If inflation goes above 3%, then we change the peg. We're going to increase the value of the currency by this or decrease it by that. All right? So the crawling peg, example, Honduras and Nicaragua. Then you have something like a crawl. All right? But it's not exactly a crawl, it's like a crawl. And they use 2%. Remember, back in the 1940 something, it was 1% plus or minus 1% the US dollar.
Mm-hmm.
So the crawl-like arrangement in Iran, China, Serbia, they use a narrow margin of 2% relative to whatever their specific trend is. It could be inflation, it could be GDP, it could be, it all depends, right? Many times they use inflation. Then you have a pegged exchange rate within horizontal bands. So the horizontal band is similar to what we spoke about, plus or minus 1% of a fixed rate, or the margin between the maximum and minimum value of the exchange rate. You wouldn't let it exceed 2%. So different countries have different things, but it's known what they are, and they only change them once it goes beyond the plus or minus 1%. Then the central bank is going to make an adjustment. So that's the central bank. The central bank is responsible for issuing currency, buying and selling, and monitoring what is happening to your currency, to your exchange rate as the economy changes. All right? Hence the reason that the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, for example, doesn't just address the banking system where it regulates the bank, but it also focuses on the economic performance of its member countries through its research department, which is the research is economic research. So they study all of the economic indicators over time, and they will make forecasts, they will make predictions, they focus on government spending, government borrowing, all right? So that's what the central banks do, because the economy, what's happening in the economy is, and how the government is spending and taking in money affects your currency, right?
Okay.
Then you have some other arrangements. So far we've done what? So far we did flexible.
Okay.
We did pegs. How many pegs we spoke about? Conventional peg, crawling peg, crawl like peg.
Goodness me.
Then we have some other managed arrangements.
So funny.
They change their policies often. Usually, got a question? Usually those countries tend to have political instability, right? And so as the political environment changes, they will change their arrangements. If you notice, Sudan, Cambodia, Algeria, those are countries that usually have political instability. Then you have the floating. It's demand and supply, however, we know that there's intervention. And then there's free floating with little or no intervention, and that's present in Australia, Canada, Mexico, Japan, the UK, United States, and the Eurozone. Why do you think they can have a floating arrangement with no intervention, free float? Heaven and Richard, and Heaven and Richard supposed to be able to answer you.
Okay.
Why do you think they have a free float?
Because like it says that the market conditions are very volatile, so it constantly changes.
I didn't quite hear that.
Why are they able to leave their currency and not intervene? Rachel, that question was for you on Heaven. Why do you think places like Australia, Canada, Mexico, Japan, the UK, United States can just allow their currencies to float without any major intervention? It has to do with their trading and the export.
Okay.
They have manufacturing, they
Okay.
huh? They do a lot of trading. Countries in the Eurozone export a lot, and so the demand for their currency is natural. Demand and supply. The demand for the currencies of these countries is, except maybe like Mexico, is fairly stable. However, Mexico, remember, Mexico does do a lot of manufacturing, and the U.S. has, they have agriculture as well, and the U.S. also utilizes Mexico. A lot of the U.S. multinationals have factories and so on in Mexico. Right? So although their currency is not extremely strong, they can allow it to float because the demand is there. Right? Okay. So we looked at exchange rate regimes, all right? We looked at how these would have changed over time, and we recognized that it was important for countries to come together. The world's largest countries with the largest economies, needed to come together to ensure that, but basically what they're doing was protecting their countries, protecting their economies, all right? By coming together and agreeing on how their exchange rates would work, all right? So you now have monetary systems. So what countries have recognized is that, or blocks of countries have recognized, is that it makes more sense for them to work together, all right? And so in the United States, you have states. Each state has its own government, but each state also has a representative in the federal government, yes? Congress and the Senate, but each state has its own. They agreed to use the US dollar, all right? So that's the dollar, they use the US dollar. Those who were in 1001, how many Federal Reserve banks are there in the US? Anybody remember? Several, how many? 12. Let me look for the people. Where are they? I see one here. They're smiling.
It's because of the landscape, like so many.
They have
yeah.
12 banks in 12 regions.
Okay.
All right?
Awesome.
Okay. So you have our monetary system, Eastern Caribbean. It was the only multi-country central bank in many, many years. There's a group of countries in Africa that has a single central bank as well. All right? And then you have the European monetary system. So way back, before 1976, when the rest of the world, along with Europe, decided that they would abandon the gold standard, they would go to flexible exchange rates, the European countries recognized that it was important to have an economic union, similar to what we have. However, those countries do a lot more production, both manufacturing and otherwise agricultural, all right? And so they decided to come together as an economic union, right? The countries had their separate currencies, but they agreed that they would limit the band on their currencies to plus or minus 1.125%. All right? So they were going to keep a band there. They were going to maintain that. And the way they're able to maintain that is in how they manage their economy. Okay? They refer to it as a snake because the individual currencies move very closely together. So in the European Economic Union, what you found was that the French franc, the German mark, the pound, even the peso, the Spanish currency, the Italian lira, those are the currencies of those countries, all right? The values were very similar. And they made that agreement. They needed to do that so that they could trade with each other. And they would, so encouraging that trade by keeping the currencies very close together meant that one country didn't have a major advantage over the other. Because if the value of your currency declines too much, then it's going to cost more for you to import, all right? And it will be cheaper for people buying from you, right? So the demand for your goods will go up, and eventually demand and supply should bring your currency back into alignment. But they didn't want to take any chances, and so they had a very narrow band. All right? We know that post that, after that, they had they developed a single currency, the euro, and to have that single currency, the countries had to agree to maintain certain economic indicators within a particular range. So things like inflation, their budget deficits, their primary surplus, overall surplus, all right? Their debt to GDP ratios, they had to keep them within certain ranges to be able to use the euro. So what you found happening was that not all of the countries adopted the euro in 1999. Not all of them were allowed to come in, all right? So you had France, Germany, Austria, Belgium, Finland, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. There were other countries in Europe, but they were not allowed to use the euro as yet because their deficits, their budget deficits, their balance of payments and so on were out of whack. So what they had was convergence criteria, okay? So you see here that Slovenia, Cyprus, Malta, Slovakia, Estonia, it's put something here, Latvia and Lithuania, they adopted the currency much later than the others, right? It's important to note that they had an economic union prior to having their currency.